good afternoon, and a very good morning, a very good early morning to those people watching in Europe at the moment. My name is David Kernot, and I will be chairing this panel on CVE policy, practice, and program challenges. Unfortunately, we've had a late-minute message from Anne-Marie, and she won't be available. So this session will run for 80 minutes instead. But we have three excellent presenters, and I would encourage everyone to refer to their bios that are in the pack that we received. I'll give presenters a 5-minute warning, and I'll give them a 1-minute warning before I appear to then start the next session. But the first presenter is Inés Bolaños Somoano, and I apologize for my pronunciation. Inés is a PhD researcher at the European University Institute, which happens to be in Florence, in Italy. And I think it's around about 4:30 a.m. there at the moment, but I might have that wrong. Her presentation is titled A Change of Heart, or How the European Union Became a Prevention Innovator. Over to you, Inés.
Hello, nice to be here with you. If at some point I seem confused or adult, please forgive me, it is 4:30 in the Netherlands right now. So without further ado, I hope that you will see my screen. Excellent, I think you do. All right, so a change of heart, or how the EU became a prevention innovator. So before I start, I want to say that this is one of my first thesis chapters, now currently being transformed into an article, so very much still a work in progress at this stage. So every and all feedback will be welcome and hopefully will help me improve this paper. So what is, sorry, I'm having some troubles. Oh, here we go. So what is the context of the paper? What is the purpose of this paper? Very straightforward. The idea is that the regime of prevention governance that we live in right now, it's a relatively novel phenomena of the last 15, 20 years. And what this paper is trying to do is trying to look at the European Union level of policymaking and trying to provide a coherent structure explanation of this change. So there are bits and pieces explained of this change already in the literature, but this paper is trying to bring all of this together into one larger coherent explanation of how the EU became the prevention innovator that it is today. So more specifically, this paper is trying to answer questions related to how prevention, despite being a counterterrorism or a sub-policy of counterterrorism, is nevertheless nested within a social policy environment, having very often to do with social policy areas like education or street work. So one of the research questions, or one of the things that hopefully this paper answers, is why this sub-policy field is created in the EU, and why is it nested within the social policy environment, instead of being nested by a security or a more traditional counterterrorism policy environment. Plot twist, we're going to try to answer all of this using collective secretization theory. So another question guiding this research is what this collective secretization theory can bring to the table in terms of explaining large change in the European Union. So this is where I don't want to waste most of my time, so I'm going to go really quickly. If there are any questions, hopefully we can address them in the Q&A. But the approach that I'm taking for this paper is basically model of two theoretical bedrocks. The first one is the collective securitization model, which is a modified version of the securitization model. So a relatively recent redevelopment of this concept from 2019, mostly included in special West European politics issue, where the focus is on how the EU can act as a collective securitization actor. And it is also trying to overcome certain known flaws in securitization theory when it tries to be applied to large institutions. So the idea is that, yes, the EU is a non-straightforward actor in the sense compared to traditional individual actors, but it can nevertheless be conceptualized to have agency in the securitization, in the securitizing moves, but so do the member states in a way. So we will get into this later at the analysis stage. And also, I guess what this paper is trying to also keep in mind is to link developments at the EU policy level with larger discourses and larger changes around conceptualizations of terrorism at that time or parallel or even prior to the development of this EU prevention policy field. So the way that the paper is structured basically follows all of the stages. I'm gonna momentarily become freezed more points because again 4:30. My apologies. The analysis tries to follow each of these stages, and it does. Oh, sorry, this is a slide that should have been before. But so obviously this is not research happening in a vacuum. There are previous accounts in the literature trying to talk about the EU, how the EU specifically developed the project, the prevention model that it has right now. This research is coming mostly from an EU institutional studies angle, although some of it is also coming from terrorism studies. And one of the key findings of the literature that we're also going to depart from that I depart from in my analysis is the idea that Madrid and London were catalyst events that had the same weight for the EU's development as 9/11 had for the American development. This paper is based on qualitative research. So basically one completed sample of interviews with basically members of the European Union that were somehow who somehow influenced this policy-making process or who were involved in drafting EU documents related to this process. It mostly includes people from the Commission, but there's also people from the Council and the European Parliament, as well as being complemented. So on the one hand, there is this interview qualitative analysis, and on the other hand, there are also policy documents used to supplement this paper. You won't see them mentioned explicitly in my presentation because I ran out of space, time, and there was already too much text on my slides. But this is something that I am planning to incorporate more explicitly on the paper, which, as I said, it's being written as of now. Right, so let's start with the first stage of the analysis, which is a status quo, which refers to the situation before there is a situation. In the European Union, we have a moment of heterogeneity where nevertheless, never minding the impact of 9/11, national action has still been very up and down. Some countries have been more European Union member state countries have been more active, and others have been less active, depending on their personal experiences and the attacks they have or have not experienced at that point, and their personal experience with terrorism. And sorry, excuse me, ignore the last sentence, it should not be there. And basically prevention does not exist in counterterrorism policy. It is a no concept. Then we have the precipitating event, so the catalyst or the trigger or the beginning point for the securitizing move. In this case, my interviews basically confirm something taken from the institutional literature, which is that the 2004 attacks in Madrid and to some extent also the London 2005 bombings were key for motivating policymaking at the EU level, both on the part of EU officials who rush to action, but also on the part of member states like the UK, Spain, in a first instance, and later on also the Netherlands, who went to the EU sphere, to the European sphere, to raise this issue of terrorism, because there is at this point the perception that you know, this wave of terrorism is new for policymakers. There is a lot of unknown incognitives and unknown dimensions, and this needs to be filled in with new knowledge, and the EU is an ideal place for that, for generating new knowledge, clarifying concepts, and basically coordinating a response that again is perceived to be very necessary because of the transnational or the perceived transnational nature of the attacks of the early 2000s and the homegrown dimension of these attacks, the idea that they were carried out by not somebody who came from outside the European Union space, but somebody who was raised within the EU and who radicalized home. So this event, again, precipitates action on the part of certain member states who go to the EU policy making field and try to advance policy making, obviously with also specific directions in mind. So again, this widespread idea that that there's a new kind of terrorism and that there is new knowledge to be needed, and that there is a need for transnational coordination, especially, but not only at the EU level, also with the United States. All of these ideas create the facilitating conditions in which the securitizing move, can also happen. Because of these new facets of terrorism, there is a very good reason or a very good rationale for member states and EU officials alike to be interested in developing something new about this, or a new solution to this threat. Another facilitating condition that we're gonna explore a bit more if we have the time at the end of the analysis is the idea that because prevention was not a policy field before at the national level, it was also relatively easy for it to develop at the EU level as a coordinated EU response, at least on a certain level, because there was no competition with national national equivalents of the institution, as is the case with other policymaking areas in the EU. Then to the securitizing move, and I'm going to mention very briefly that there is an issue with securitization theory, which is the issue of agency, where there's often a not too clear line between the securitizing move and the audience response. This is the move to present certain solutions to certain framing of the problem, and the sort of like response from the public, which in turn also affects the precise shape of the securitizing move. In collective securitization theory, largely these two steps, the securitizing move and the audience response, tend to be mixed into one. I'm presenting them here separately because I think it also helps clarify a bit what the relationship is between the EU and the member states and how their agencies composite in this sort of like collective securitization move. So you see that here I've modeled it, and again, this is not a 100% clear-cut line that you can draw, but this is my abstract approximation for the model, which is that you have the EU, especially the EU Commission, but also the Council, as the securitizing agents, whose securitizing move, basically, it's the creation of a new ontology of terrorism, so new definitions, new knowledge, new approach to terrorism, but also, you know, creating the new categories of acceptable response for terrorism. So prevention, basically, as a policy field, and how, oh my, I hope I'm not too much over time. No, I think I have 5 minutes now. Okay. Sorry, so the securitizing move in this case is the creation of knowledge around terrorism and the creation of new acceptable governance solutions for this new kind of terrorism. Of course, this is also accompanied by the creation of new bodies and new actors who are meant to enforce, develop, coordinate these new definitions and these new proposed solutions. Whereas the, oh God, are you gonna do this to me again? Whereas the audience response in this case is mostly coming from the member states, although you could very well, and here what I want to make clear is that the member state is not the only level of audience response. If you look at something different, you could look at, for example, intra-institutional audience response within the EU. So you could also look at, you know, how the European Parliament, for example, has been also contesting, influencing, ultimately agreeing with prevention policy. But in this case, for the sake of this model, we are only or mostly focusing on member states and how they have also influenced the policy field immersion via their own policy preferences. These policy preferences are, of course, dictated by many different factors which have to do with the countries themselves and with their own development of counterterrorism measures and their own approach to counterterrorism. But to briefly put it out, the main two ways that member states have influenced this is either, directly by you know, providing their own threat assessments and their own problem framings, indirectly or directly by adding specific issues to the agenda at different policy documents, like focusing on foreign fighters or returnees, or bringing up specific problems for each member state to be resolved collectively also at the EU level. Also, of course, the rotating presidency commissions, council commissions, and so on are also a vehicle for member states to have stronger or weaker influence in their response to the EU level secretariatism move. Right, so this secretariatism move crystallizes, and I'm going to go really quickly now because I'm running out of time, but it basically goes, it's reflected in policy outputs. These policy outputs are not only policy-based, but they also have equivalents in real life ministries and new departments within the different member states. I've already explained a bit what this new prevention paradigm looks like, but basically the result of this secretariatism move is that you have a new status quo where there's a lot more homogeneity at the EU, within the EU, in terms of policy measures and approaches, at least on some areas of prevention. But there is, whereas in others, such as right-wing terrorism, there's a lot more divergence. But however, there's a general acceptance of prevention and of the role of the EU as coordinator and knowledge producer within this new policy sphere. And this is just a hint or a teaser, but this secretariatism move is not necessarily over and done. There might be other waves of secretarization that that depart from new attacks, and I would say that this is probably the case for right-wing terrorism as it has been developed within the EU policy prevention sphere. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Inés, that was great. Now we're going to move on quickly because I'm not fast enough. Mark is going to be online now. So Mark Duckworth is a senior research fellow at the Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalization at Deakin University. His presentation is titled Politics and the Origins and Development of Countering Violent Extremism Policy in Australia. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you very much. What I'm going to do is a quick canter through 20 years of Australian politics, and clearly I've been selective on things that I've included, and there'll be other things that I've left out, but it makes sense in the context of the issues that I want to raise. Now, the first thing to say is that the issues that we're dealing with in Australia, obviously there's a political authorizing environment which we're operating. Here we are at this conference and we're all talking about things on the basis of evidence and our research, but we operate and public servants and people working in law enforcement within an authorizing environment set by their political masters. And the overall narrative, what's included, what's left out, what's emphasized, is decided by ministers. And over these last 20 years, there have been a number of shifts, some of them subtle, some of them dramatic. There's also the issue that violent extremism and terrorism is something that politicians have used to gain political advantage. There's another issue, which is that the political and media environment within Australia varies considerably across Australia, depending on the state. So there have been different responses according to where you are. Before 2001, within Australia, terrorism was largely a technical issue. The body that was set up after the Hilton bombing, SACPAV, of which I was once a member, was largely a policy-free zone. This all changed clearly in 2001. A precursor to the 11 September attacks was the MV Tampa events, which have a connection, which I'll come to in a moment. But then after the 9/11 attacks, we had the November federal election in which John Howard was re-elected. The following year, he called together a transnational crime and terrorism summit. Then we had the Bali bombing and the new intergovernmental agreement, which set up the National Counterterrorism Committee. And the structures which exist today were largely set up in that time. Now, one of the things that I've drawn up here is what I've called a political playbook around countering violent extremism. And it is clearly oversimplified, but then of course we must remember that evidence and nuance don't win elections. But nonetheless, it's a few things to recognize that the issues and distinctions that I'm going to talk about, not always party political, that from these two playbooks that I have here, politicians often try to pick parts according to their audience. And so it's a question of either or, but there are a number of tensions here which have, I think, led to a degree of policy ambiguity. What I've described as the war on terror playbook is really around saying it's all about strong laws, police and intelligence led. Terrorism is caused by other people, largely related to immigration. It's a problem of Islam. Muslim leaders need to be strong against extremism. There's a problem with multiculturalism. And extremists are bad people, and to explain is to excuse. So that doesn't leave a lot of room for undertaking research or into issues around violent extremism. The whole of society playbook has an approach looking at laws need to be proportionate to the threat, looking at personal and social causes of extremism, understanding the religion and ideology is only one component of extremism, seeking to support Muslim communities in the face of demonization, seeing multiculturalism as an asset, looking to undertake research and fund research, concern over right-wing extremism, and also a focus on inclusion, belonging, and resilience. A couple of things about political context which underpin much of what I'm going to talk about. One is to do with federalism. Now, the basis of federalism is dual sovereignty, and people in the United States and Germany and Canada and others will fully understand that. One of the things that happened in Australia during this period under John Howard was the centralisation of power. Greg Craven has called this out as being unusual for a Conservative government. But John Howard took over much of the, you might say, the Gough Whitlam centralising playbook, including rebranding the Commonwealth of Australia as the Australian government. And Craven, who himself was a Conservative political commentator, commented that you saw what he described as the widest, most intense attack on states and federalism since the Second World War. In contrast, the states and territories, both Liberal, National and Labor, joined together and formed the Council for the Australian Federation. They put out a number of documents, including one published by Anne Toomey and Glenn Withers, talking about federalism and its important role. And a couple of these things are important in relation to development of countering violence extremism policy, including the issue around customization of policies, that across Australia, there are differences in climate, geography, demography, culture, resources, and industry, which means different approaches are needed to meet local needs. And also this issue around creativity. In the United States, the states are often called the laboratories of democracy, allowing innovation and experimentation. A second issue of political context around multiculturalism and immigration. Now, views of multiculturalism vary across Australia. But certainly during that time, there was some significant differences. John Howard stated in his autobiography that he intended to end the divisive features of multiculturalism and place a greater emphasis on those things which united us as Australians. By contrast, in Victoria, for instance, you have Victorian premiers, both Jeff Kennett and Steve Bracks, for instance, both being ministers for multicultural affairs, both promoting multiculturalism, and Jeff Kennett, for instance, being the first political leader in Australia to call out and criticise Pauline Hanson. And John Howard, in his autobiography, actually criticises Kennett's stance on multiculturalism quite a lot. There's also the issue around securitization of immigration, which is not unique to Australia, and but it's one of the things which is a background to what's going on here. In particular, in relation to the politics of the time, that in 2001, then Defence Minister Peter Reith talked around boat arrivals being can be a pipeline for terrorists to come into Australia. The Courier Mail, just a few days before the election of that year, said PM links terror to asylum seekers, although I think it's important to say John Howard never actually said that. John Howard was Prime Minister for as long as he was because he was exceedingly careful in what he said and how he said it, and he managed to nuance his language and took a great deal of care about what he said. But nonetheless, this did lead to a narrative by some politicians in the media that, you know, all potential terrorists in Australia are foreigners or immigrants or from families of recent migrants, and that coloured some of the debate at the time. But it's also important to point out that the Director General of Security in 2002 at a conference in Hobart, in a paper which I was present for, actually specifically rejected the link between asylum seekers and terrorism. By contrast, you'll see Steve Bracks as Premier of Victoria, putting a very different point of view and actually being, after he left office, even more stridently critical of John Howard's approach, and talking about criticizing a political party using fear as a pretty miserable thing. So I think that's one of the biggest dangers to multiculturalism. It also led, interestingly, for the Victorian government to commission a report from the Global Terrorism Research Centre on perceptions of multiculturalism and security, which actually examined the issue around was multiculturalism one of the causes of terrorism. And this piece of work done by Pete Lentini, Anna Huff, and Elena Ogru, which actually surveyed, might say, non-minority Victorians, came up with a view and understanding that in Victoria, at least a few participants drew links between multiculturalism and security threats to counterterrorism. And I think that certainly it's one of the things that within Victoria, multiculturalism has played well as an issue for both sides of politics, whereas in other states, perhaps less so. There's also one of the other underlying issues that I just want to touch on is whose communities are they? Throughout the history of preventing and countering violent extremism policy in Australia, there's a question of, you know, is a community in Bankstown in Broadmeadows part of the New South Wales Victorian community or the Australian community? And political rivalry has meant that, you know, New South Wales, Victorian and Commonwealth governments have sometimes argued over this. A Commonwealth view that they're all part of the Australian community, New South Wales and Victorian governments viewing that they're part of their communities, and communities themselves expressing concern that they were being over-consulted, over-investigated by governments implementing different policies. So by 2004, basically the view was that the predominant threat was transnational terrorism in the name of an extremist form of Islam. That all changed in 2005 with the London bombings in 2005, plus Operation Pendennis, leading to arrests in Melbourne and Sydney. There was a calls for a new discussion on terrorism. Premiers called for a special CERG meeting. Prime Minister announced he would seek agreement from the states on control orders, preventive detention, and stop, question, and search powers. By contrast, the Victorian government and Steve Bracks in particular put out a couple of papers that stressed the need to look at the causes of why some people attack society in which they live. And one of the reasons I'm talking about Steve Bracks and Victoria in particular is to understand the nature of politics in Australia was that the brutal nature of both politics and the media in New South Wales meant that the then Premier of New South Wales, Bob Carr, did not want to enter into this debate in this way, while these issues were ones that resonated for Steve Bracks the politics that he was following. But nonetheless, it's important to recognize that he did support tough new laws. And I think this is one of the issues, that in order to give him social license to pursue other policy objectives, he also had to support those areas of new legislation. Now, in 2005, 2006, he put out a couple of papers, one of which was stressing the need to understand why people adopt terrorist tactics, stressing the importance of working with faith communities and building trust. And he also made the statement in 2005, adherence to traditional Muslim practice are not inconsistent with a strong Australian identity, a statement which is unremarkable, but at the time he was the only political leader in Australia actually saying that. The following year put out another paper which included funding for the Global Terrorism Research Centre at Monash University, which was an important step in developing countering violent extremism policy in Australia, and a lot of the work which was done on understanding terrorism in Australian context, some of it the lead chief investigator being Greg Barton, and many people involved in this conference were involved in that research, which included development of, for instance, the TRIM model of understanding and indicators of radicalization. But these two papers and this work was actually the beginning of countering violent extremism policy development in Australia. The following year, there was the National Action Plan to build social cohesion and harmony and security. And this was promulgated by the federal government in conjunction with states. And so there was, and John Howard, ever nimble, recognized he needed also to, as well as being strong on terror, needed to actually start talking about social cohesion and so on. Then there was a period in Australia of, you might say, a political truce. And you can see this the counterterrorism white paper came out and stressed the need for cooperative federalism. And this paper also set out key elements in Australia's strategy, focusing on both protection and resilience, and the need to building a strong, resilient Australian community to resist the development of any form of violent extremism and terrorism on the home front. The National Counter-Terrorism annual 10-year anniversary report also spoke about the shift towards countering violent extremism. This period also saw the establishment of the Countering Violent Extremism Subcommittee of the NCTC, and this, which is from their published annual report, which is online, points out the focus on CVE activities. So we actually begin to see the architecture around CVE that is still largely in place today, and many of the themes being set out and continuing. This whole process was interrupted by politics again during the period that Tony Abbott was Prime Minister, and in his National Security Statement of 2005, he made a number of statements, famously calling talking about the lure of this death cult, while acknowledging the importance of working with local communities. This statement did also include the point that he was talking about new measures to strengthen immigration laws, and the statement which caused a lot of problems, which is, I've often heard Western leaders describe Islam as a religion of peace. I wish more Muslim leaders would say it more often and mean it. At the same time, governments were attempting to write a new counter-terrorism strategy, one which did come out and which was endorsed by the Council of Australian Governments, but it was very much a compromise between competing different views. And so it's more of a description than a strategy. But the 5 basic core elements it outlines are still fundamental in underscoring and underlining and underpinning the work on CVE in Australia today. And this 2015 strategy remains the last one which has been published. But however, one issue with it was focused on ISIL and Al-Qaeda and people inspired by Australia by these groups. It only had passing reference terrorism or extremism by other groups, which is being a fault with it. However, because of the AVERT approach, a number of other governments, including Victoria and New South Wales government, developed their own policies around countering violent extremism. The Victorian government set up a social cohesion community resilient task force looking at collective actions across governments and community and academia. And it had a number of objectives, such as supporting a socially cohesive Victoria underpinned by social justice, and really stress the issue of participation and resilience. New South Wales too developed its own approach, in particular the Multicultural New South Wales Compact, which was funded by Premier Mike Baird in 2015. And New South Wales Compact, which another member of this panel, Malcolm Haddon, had a lot to do in developing, again focused in an innovative way around the making communities more resilient in the face of adversity and crisis, including terrorism and extremism, and strengthening our sense of community and social cohesion. Immediately he became Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, at the same time, end of 2015, one of the first things he did was bring together members of a government, state and territory and Commonwealth governments across both the social policy and law enforcement areas for a meeting on countering violent extremism. And in his autobiography, he was pretty robust in his views on the rhetoric of Tony Abbott, and said what the problems were. And he said, my measured tone was noticed by the Muslim communities whose cooperation was absolutely vital. Then 2019, the Christchurch mosque shootings really changed the tragic and horrific as they are, also meant that the narrative around terrorism in Australia meant that terrorists could no longer be characterized as other. It also meant that there was some criticism by the opposition of the Commonwealth government around whether it had double standards on Islamist and right-wing extremism. The Director General of Security made it quite clear that right-wing extremism has been in ASIO's sights for some time, but that threat came into sharp focus in New Zealand, terrible focus. Some of the politics around this involved a Conservative politician objecting to use of the word right-wing extremism. Others commented that on the hurt caused by 20 years of reference to Islamist extremism, and then so ASIO adopted more neutral language. So finally, I think when 2021, there's less reason for anyone to exploit violent extremism for political advantage, given the understanding the multiple causes and multiple different ideologies behind extremism. But there has been damage from 20 years of othering Muslim communities. The pandemic has brought new issues, in particular with conspiracy theories, which for some politicians to exploit. But through all this and through all these changes, there's been a high degree of collaboration between government officials, communities, academics on these issues. And of course, we now await the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence inquiry into extremist movements. So over 20 years, violent extremism policy has shifted depending on views of political leaders and their governments, and it has shaped the way in which we have addressed these issues. But one of the last things I want to leave us with is whether this political disputes have actually created an inherent ambiguity in Australia's approach in trying to be at the same time tough on terror, supporting multiple counterterrorism laws, and seeking a community-led approach based on more resilient communities. And the question is whether this has damaged the CVE brand. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Mark. That was a really great presentation, and I'm sure we'll get lots of questions during the Q&A. Right, so our last presenter for this panel is Dr. Richard McNeil-Willson, who is a research fellow at the Robert Schuman Centre for Advanced Studies in the European University Institute, which I think is in Florence in Italy. His presentation is titled Pro and Antisocial Resilience, Possibilities for Stabilising Resilience within CVE. Over to you, Richard.
Hi there. Good afternoon and good morning from Central European time. Yep, my name is Dr. Richard McNeil-Willson, and I'm working here at the European University Institution in Florence. And as part of the work I've been doing here, I've been working with the Building Resilience Against Violent Extremism and Polarization project. The BRAVE project is a 3-year European Commission Horizon 2020 funded project, which explores the causes behind violent extremism and polarization across contemporary Europe, how and whether resilience building could potentially be used as a response to violent extremism and polarization, and how we can support practitioners, policymakers, educators, grassroots projects, and a range of other stakeholders in responding to violent extremism and polarization using resilience building practices. As a project, we're based in Europe with various European partners, but the project was and has been sort of co-written and supported directly from people at Deakin, very kindly by Vivian Guerin, for instance, as well as receiving additional guidance from Michelle Grossman. So some of the points that I just want to kind of go over and explore as part of these 15-20 minutes will draw from broader BRAVE discussions, but are in this context very much my own views and ideas that have come out of them. It's also, yeah, it's important just to kind of note these discussions that have been had around the BRAVE project and where these discussions on resilience are coming from. I don't have a presentation. I'm just going to speak, if that's all right. And I just want to use this time as a means to highlight some of the points of contention or discussion that I think exist within current conceptualizations of resilience, to explore where there is some kind of current instability in its conceptualization, and where therefore key sites of research are needed in the future to take the term forward and potentially re-stabilize it or recast it within CVE. As a disclaimer as well, I'm aware that I'm doing this in a conference full of some leading experts on resilience within a CVE context. So I do this very tentatively and with a great amount of humility, but I think I want to kind of bring some kind of critical discussions on terrorism studies and terrorism approaches to explore some of the points of perhaps tension within this idea of resilience and CVE. I want to start maybe this with a bit of a story, a bit of a background context, partly because it's reaching the closing stages of the conference, the panel, and I think it's a good way to kind of set the scene and the context for this discussion. So first of all, back in 2017, I was conducting PhD research, hanging out with members and activists of Hizb ut-Tahrir, and a group that's also active in Australia. And the group I was hanging out with at the time was in Denmark, running interviews with the group in Copenhagen and Aarhus. Now, for those of you who aren't aware, Hizb ut-Tahrir can be broadly described as a non-violent Islamist group for all the kind of problems and discussions around that term. They were one of the first to sort of come up with the concept of re-establishing an Islamic state in the early 1950s. They are avowedly anti-democratic, anti-nation state, and generally have been very critical of concepts of integration, and have historically tended to cause some trouble when it comes to community cohesion. They thus quite neatly tend to fall under discussions of extremism in recent years. However, they are, even according to some of their strongest critics, non-violent, so fit quite accurately within discussions of non-violent extremism. Talking with members on the streets of Copenhagen, it soon became clear that Hizb ut-Tahrir Scandinavia were particularly keen to showcase to me some of the work they'd been conducting in local communities that we would maybe not expect of so-called extremist groups. And I want to read one quote that I have here from an interview from a member who stated, "The police in Denmark have said that if it wasn't for Hizb ut-Tahrir, we would have a lot more Muslims being in gangs because we give them an Islamic identity, which helps them to go in a different direction than being criminals. We have been doing lots of anti-knife crime initiatives, for instance, talking to youth about the dangers of weapons on the streets, and finding ways to rethink their identity in positive terms. This interview took place in the context of some quite relevant events, particularly concern around violence that had been recently perpetrated in the Narbol area of Copenhagen by one of the largest gangs in Copenhagen, loyal to Familia, with the recent shootings carried out by young people, resulting in the death of other youth. Moving on to a second part of the story, a couple of years later, COVID-19 pandemic, working in Italy, and with a lockdown sort of currently coming into effect in early 2020, it gave me the chance to investigate some of the discussions that were taking place amongst extreme groups into the COVID-19 pandemic. So early in 2020, I did a short study on far-right narratives that were taking place on Telegram in response to the pandemic. What I noticed quite early on was that some of the concerns that were being stated by CVE practitioners towards the far right weren't often being reflected or articulated online by significant far right groups as would have been expected. From quite early on, there was a lot of focus within CVE on misinformation as a significant tactic of the far right. And notable other CVE concerns included discussions around misinformation and conspiracy threats to 5G towers, for instance. However, following some neo-fascist groups, including the Nordic resistance movement, which is useful here again as to kind of keep it in one geographical Nordic context, I noticed that there were discussions around COVID-19 that seemed to conflict with this focus on misinformation. There were, for instance, groups such as the Nordic resistance movement that were highly critical of austerity politics, of cuts against welfare and inadequate emergency provisions in the context of COVID-19 that seemed more suited to even centre-left discussions on policy, for instance. One member of NIM diagnosed the problem by saying that Nordic states needed to be more involved, having more stocks than just in time, engaging in relocation, even for strategic companies in responses, and that poor government had led to insufficient hospital, police, and military resources. Other activities highlighted by the Nordic resistance movement and other well-established far-right groups included engaging in activities such as the care of vulnerable groups, such as the elderly or economically disadvantaged, the supporting of local businesses or workers' rights, the support of healthcare professionals, and volunteering with groups such as the Red Cross, as well as sharing important information about new lockdown restrictions or official scientific advice. Many were also highly critical, at least in this early stage, of governments that had failed to lock down or implement strong restrictions in response to COVID-19. This massively conflicted with the general idea within CVE that the far right were, by dint of being far right, against restrictions and lockdowns. So having introduced, this has gone into this long story. Of course, I want to add in the CVE context. So in recent years, of course, there's been this increasing prevalence on the term resilience and resilience building in the Western or sort of global Northern CVE landscape. There are, of course, here experts who are far more knowledgeable, have a far more intricate understanding of the term. But I want to offer some kind of discussion on building on these stories on this context. Whilst resilience has been traditionally used beyond a European sphere for much longer period of time to refer to sort of structural capacity or infrastructure in response to disaster and crisis, recent studies and approaches have encouraged a wider push to place concepts of resilience in the context of the global north, to create long-term community-led responses to growing societal inequality and political polarization. Resilience in this context focuses on what is keeping people resistant to violence rather than what is making them vulnerable to it, as I'm sure many of you know. In this renewed sense, therefore, it's a process that can be enhanced or diminished by the allocation and negotiation of intersecting contextual factors and resources. Of course, we have the fantastic work that's been carried out by Michelle Grossman and many others that have conceptualized different resilience factors. This has included focus on cultural identity and connectedness and the importance of cultural traditions, bridging capital, which examines the level of trust in that persons have outside of their own community or with other communities. Linking capital, which examines vertical links between individuals or communities and authorities. Violence-related beliefs, such as the willingness of individuals to speak out against violence, and violence-related behaviors, the belief of violence as a source of strength or respect or community acceptance of violence. As part of the BRAVE project, we've also identified 20 resilience factors or indicators that operate within the socio-economic, historical, political, cultural, and communication-based spheres. However, reflecting back on the opening case studies, we do see that they exhibit examples of behaviors that can be broadly conceptualized within the lens of resilience building. For instance, the anti-knife crime initiatives run by Hizb ut-Tahrir in Denmark demonstrated high levels of linking capital, including trust in police, as well as a confidence that their work was being positively interpreted and even engaged with by police, and a willingness to build further trust between Hizb ut-Tahrir and local authorities. Whilst the far-right NRM was critical of government authorities during COVID-19, it was not conveyed, at least in a way that that implied a desire to degrade the legitimacy of authorities, but rather to consider how they may be more effective in their operation. A desire to build positive identities which highlight cultural traditions is also present in extremist groups, albeit within a much more closed readings and exclusionary readings of religion and nationality. As well as certain expressions to build links across some communities. And there are clearly anti-violence beliefs or initiatives present in some of these examples. This is not new. Of course, this has already been flagged in early discussions here today, when it was underlined by speakers that extremist ecosystems are also resilient and can also be resilient and demonstrate resilience. There is an understanding, therefore, within discussions around resilience that extremist groups can display resilient characteristics, and that these can be divided within resilience into pro-social and anti-social resilience. Pro-social resilience, the kind that we as practitioners and community groups engage in. Anti-social resilience that is practiced by extremist groups. However, within this approach, there are issues that need resolving. Firstly, how do we qualify intent within this context? So could the intent of an extremist organization be, at least in part, conceptualized as positive? And are anti-social organizations able to create pro-social community impacts? For instance, where we do see anti-knife crime initiatives conducted by exclusionary Islamist groups, where do we place this on the scale of pro or anti-social resilience? How do we conceptualize far-right responses to the COVID-19 pandemic that have the potential for public good? Does the intent of an extremist organization matter? And are anti-social organizations capable of creating pro-social resilience as well as anti-social resilience? And to what extent are we as external examiners able to weigh up the different elements of pro and anti-social intent and impact by extreme groups? Secondly, and along these lines, how do we therefore conceptualize the role of the individual that is doing the weighing up of ourselves, of authorities? Terms such as radicalism and extremism, of course, have a normative, relational, and context-specific value. So one is judged radical or extremist against cultural-specific benchmarks. And this label is dependent on who is doing the labeling. How do we as academics, as policymakers, practitioners, or stakeholders determine whether a group is pro-social or anti-social? Is it based purely on the ideology of the group or the individual? In which case, are we assuming an essentialist idea of the group as bound by their ideology or text in their action? Or are we basing this on authority viewpoints, on whether an organization is designated as extremist by a country or a government, for instance, in which case, are we failing to account for potential change or development by extremist groups away from more extreme actions and assuming that groups cannot engage in group de-radicalization? Or that authorities cannot be wrong or inflammatory in their potential declaration of a group as extreme or antisocial? The category of extremist, of course, is not only dependent on who is doing the labeling, it lacks legal categorization, making identification of extremist groups and therefore who is conducting antisocial resilience based along these lines as potentially tricky. Another problem identified through research conducted elsewhere is how do we think about concepts of resilience beyond and outside the liberal and democratic context, and return this Western conceptualization of resilience to context outside of the global north. Research that will soon be released as part of the BRAVE projects involves some discussion on this and includes research with human rights and pro-democracy organizations operating in repressive authoritarian regimes. Such social movements have been repressed under the guise of counter-terror legislation, especially those who are part of a national Islamic minority. And repressed groups have responded by using resilience-building tactics. Within this context, however, it becomes very problematic to determine who is being resilient when autocratic regimes are accusing pro-democratic groups of being Islamic extremists. And these extremists, so-called extremists, are using practices of resilience to strengthen communities. It is key that resilience is able to survive outside of a Western democratic context if it is to be stabilized in a global counter-terror approach. And so finally, how do we bring this all together and take this language of resilience forward? At times when resilience is being more centralized in policy within various different global contexts, it's critical that we resolve some of these problems. So firstly, I'd like to suggest the three following suggestions. Firstly, we need to draw on other fields outside of CVE, various different contexts, to add to this term of resilience, to critique this idea of resilience, but also to kind of strengthen it in doing so. This can include, for instance, drawing further on how resilience is used in public health context, which I know has been done by Michelle and colleagues, but certainly I think there's more scope for development on this. By bringing public health measures and instruments around resilience, we can potentially broaden knowledge and practice of resilience further. Another suggestion is to maybe free the concept of resilience from ourselves, from authorities and academics. Work with grassroots organizations are further needed to create the practical resilience toolkit that is needed. One of the things I think we've done very well with the BRAVE project, and that has been most effective, is working with grassroots youth projects to think about how they can use BRAVE resilience measures, for instance. This has created an interactive way of thinking about the practicality of resilience and found places where current scholarship and practice is lacking. And thirdly, we need to better understand the role of the state in all forms of resilience. Potentially, by removing this distinction between pro and anti-social resilience, which may be potentially confusing the categorization, we could recognize that resilience building may be carried out by different actors across the spectrum and may have different results. But this is not dependent, the results are not dependent entirely on the actor that is carrying this out. This would allow us perhaps to implicate more genuinely the role of the state in creating conditions for both radicalization and de-radicalization, and recognize that authorities can potentially also engage in acts that can create pro-social resilience, but also potentially anti-social resilience, with poor practice potentially degrading community strength and divisive nationalism or illiberal regimes, also kind of creating this, this negative and anti-social resilience. These are recommendations for further research and considerations based on my engagement with the term resilience. I very much look forward to kind of opening this up to a fantastic panel and to a fantastic conference with experts on this. Ultimately, I think we do need more research and practice to understand these problems of resilience and these sort of instabilities within the concepts of resilience as a means of making it stronger and enabling it to operate outside of the current Western liberal democratic context. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Richard. That was great. As far as I'm aware, we're about to go into a Q&A session, but I think I'm slightly there's something happening and I'm not sure what's happening after this, so apologise for that. Right. I'll just start. I think we've got about 15 or so minutes where we can have some questions. So I think I'll just start with the first question. Well, actually, we've got a question here. So it's a question for Richard. Can you elaborate on how you understand the distinction between what you call antisocial resilience and maladaptive resilience, which helps people cope with adversities, but in ways that ultimately harm them and sometimes others?
I mean, I think that's a very good explanation of the differences. I mean, and I certainly think individuals such as Michelle or some of the people that we have here would be very good at sort of responding to this and understanding this. As far as I've encountered discussions of antisocial and pro-social resilience, there is this continued discussion as to what is maladaptive and what is not. This can be based around the definition of the groups that are carrying this out, the intent of groups that are carrying out, the ideology of groups that are carrying out certain kinds of resistance or resistance building practices. But I think this is a much more, I would suggest that this is a much more contested idea and open to contested field in terms of understanding what is maladaptive and what is not. Because as I sort of tried to point out with some of the case studies, it's not always easy to determine who is carrying out maladaptive and who is carrying out pro-social resilience and how that plays out. And some of the research as well that I've been conducting in illiberal, in non-democratic settings, certainly also makes that quite difficult to understand whether groups that are labeled extremist, what kind of resilience they're engaging in. I'm aware that I'm not answering the question, but I think, but I just want to kind of leave it open, because actually I do think that is something that needs to be kind of, that is a lot more elastic than is sometimes given credit for, and is a site that needs further kind of contestation, needs further research within discussions on resilience.
Thanks, Richard. I've got a question for Inés, and I hope it's not too topical, but you referred a lot of the time to the member states within the EU around your collective securitization theory model and your talk. And I was wondering, do you see any changes in policy that will occur across EU, or has there been any since Brexit and the leaving of the UK?
Thanks a lot. I mean, I cannot speak for the specifics of the Brexit impact on the EU prevention machine. If I could, I guess I would not need to finish my PhD. I would like just write that book. That's it. I'm sorted. But there is definitely new innovations, for example, in the with regards to right-wing extremism. So in the last, I would say, 5 years, some member states, I think led by Germany, Sweden, Denmark, have started homogenizing policy, trying to get all member states on the same level, trying to basically do the same that was done for, let's say, Islamist terrorism, or for the first approach to prevention policy that was modeled on, on jihadist terrorism. And it's going to be a very bumpy road, because there's, of course, a lot of tension within member states about how they frame right-wing terrorism, what they consider right-wing terrorism, things also like hate speech and hate crimes, which are often very, very tightly linked with right-wing extremist activity are differently typified in different member states' legal codes. So I think right now the intention is to create a homogeneous or more or less coherent EU level policy position to bring about also some implementation change, some more coordinated responses regarding right-wing terrorism. I hope this was the answer to your question.
I was just wondering if you'd solved the world's problems, that was all. But that was a great reply, thank you. Mark, we've got a Q&A question for you. And that is, to what degree have the policies and rhetoric of mainstream politicians emboldened the far right here in Australia?
Well, I think there's a difference between the political discourse in Australia compared to, for instance, the United States. So mainstream politicians have not adopted a lot of the rhetoric that you've seen in the United States. But I think one of the issues is that there has been license given to some of the voices of the extreme right wing. I think initially, given some of the way in which extremism and terrorism was characterized back in the immediate period after 2001. So I don't think the current politicians are emboldening the extreme right wing, but I think that there were some of the political debates which I spoke about meant that there were things that could have been called out which were not called out as strongly as could have been, and maybe some of the debate got away in a way that hasn't been useful. Now, it is also a complex political issue, and I mentioned, John Howard's autobiography, and he actually goes into this in some detail, that he was, the dispute between him and Jeff Kennett was that his view was that Kennett did not understand that from his point of view as Prime Minister, if he had taken a stronger line, for instance, on Pauline Hanson back then in the same way as Jeff Kennett did, that would have meant that there are a whole lot of people who were kind of pushed into the extreme. So from Howard's point of view, he was in fact, by playing what he would regard as a more nuanced game, was actually attempting to keep people on not on the far right, but more on that wing, within mainstream politics, rather than forcing them into extremist politics. So I think that's so there would be an interesting discussion about that. So John Howard would take the view that in fact what he did was actually stopped the far right getting a foothold here, while others would have the view that in fact his failure to call it out as strongly as he could have done in fact emboldened them. So that's an issue which I think is open to further discussion.
Thanks for that, Mark. I was going to jump around a bit. I've got a few questions, and this one's for Richard. And I was just thinking about what you were talking about around pro-social resilience and the anti-social resilience between the two different groups of community and extremists. I was just wondering, how does culture play into resilience and resilience building around CVE in your space in Europe?
Culture in terms of the use of culture in CVE practice.
Yes.
So yes, sorry, it's not your question. Yeah, I mean, as part of the research we've been doing, certainly we've been looking at cultural factors. We've been identifying cultural factors that may play a part, or sort of seen as playing a part in polarization and also potentially in resilience building as well. I mean, this, things that we've kind of been looking at include sort of having a complex and flexible cultural identity, and the role this plays as a form of bridging between different communities, the role of family support and a collective identity as well, and how we can support that, and the role that a sense of belonging could also play in building sort of resilience within this context. So certainly we've been looking at cultural factors, and I think within a European field where there's been a lot of focus on ideology, I think culture offers something a bit more nuanced, a bit more sort of that engages with community and community issues and issues of identity, that avoids some of the essentializing language of early CVE and CT in Europe that focuses on ideology. Certainly it's core to some of the work that we've been doing. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask a question. I'll probably chew up all of my time just asking the question for Mark, but I'll do my best. So, as we've heard from other, presentations today, there is now focus on the potential for mainstreaming CVE by moving away from community-specific programming and policy. What are your views from a policy perspective on mainstreaming, and does this just avoid the problems around how we understand communities and community engagement in the current complex operating environment?
Well, I think that many of the things which we're talking about in preventing and countering violent extremism, and other people have made this comment as well, there's a lot of things which are just good social policy to roll out anyway. And I suppose goes back to this issue which I was raising at the end around what you actually call it. Should we actually no longer call it countering violent extremism, but something else? And other people have talked about this too, because in the early years, less in Australia than in Britain, a whole lot of good social policies were branded as counter-terrorism measures, which immediately led to them being regarded with suspicion. And although within Australia that hasn't happened to quite the same degree, it goes back to the point that I was saying before, is that many of the things which I included that list around, the whole society approach, if it had been possible to actually roll those out, 15, 20 years ago, without having to engage in some of the more, the rhetoric around around terrorism, then it may have actually been more effective. But one of the things is that there is a whole cohort of people in the media and in politics who regard countering violent extremism and preventing violent extremism as being soft. And that, in fact, it goes back to some of the things that Amber made in her previous commentary around, people in prison. If one just takes the view that extremists are bad people and they deserve whatever they get, then all this effort is regarded as not being tough enough. And so that in order to have license to operate in the area of the more whole of society approach, most politicians do have to also say, we're going to pass tough laws, we're going to be tough on terrorism. And so there's not a lot of argument around these things. And indeed, that's one of the reasons why I think in Australia, people have commented in previous sessions, there'd be 92 laws or whatever in Australia, which is an enormous number worldwide. And a lot of it is because neither side of politics actually wants to have a really big political debate around that side of things. And so I think that's one of the complexities in which we live. But certainly I think mainstreaming a lot of these things would be a good thing if one can divorce it from some of the other measures.
Thanks, Mark. That's great. Well, we've run out of time for questions and answers. So I'd like to just thank the contributors today, Richard, Inés, and Mark, for your contributions. I thought that was really great. And so now we have a 40-minute break, and we should reconvene at 4:30 Victorian time, Eastern States time. Thank you.